Welcome to Talk of the Town. I'm David Frankel, your host tonight. This edition of Talk of the Town is about the aftermath of the override vote, which failed to pass last December, I guess December 7th. The folks here that I've got here tonight are going to talk about the unfunded mandates and specifically the things about the education budget that are going to be affected by this failed override vote. I'd like to introduce the panel here tonight. Paul Casey, our member for Winchester, thank you for coming tonight.
Good to see you, Dave.
Mel Kluckner, who has just become our town manager.
David.
Nice to have you here. Jim Marini, the school superintendent. Nice to have you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. And Carolyn Hintlian, who is the co-chair of the Special Education PAC. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm sure we're going to be talking more about special education in the course of this discussion. But my first question is going to go to Paul. Everybody talks about unfunded mandates. What are they? And who are the perpetrators of these unfunded mandates?
Yeah, they seem to be hiding everywhere, these unfunded mandates. They're under the stairwell. It's like every town and community terrified and terrorized by unfounded mandates. I think in general, those edicts that are provided by the state or federal, in most cases it's usually the federal government that said that the state has to comply in some form or fashion. And you see that if the state doesn't comply in certain regulatory fashion via transportation codes or like updates on highways or speed limits on highways, they don't get transportation funding on the federal side. It happens in education where there's special education, certain requirements that are made federally, and the state in some ways can carry it even further. And it's something that literally is not funded, but it's mandated. And so when you hear unfunded mandate, it usually is something that is described as the state or federal government forcing communities to do something that they might otherwise not do. In general.
So there's an element of blackmail associated with it? Would that be the right description?
Well, there's a lot of leveraging, certainly. The big ticket items that come down into the community really have not existed in a recent format. They're there, but I might query that I think a lot of these quote unquote unfunded mandates are items and topics that mainly towns like Winchester probably would have covered on their own anyways, in so many ways. Now, Jim, we might take exception to that. We can get back, but a lot of times they're like kind of the right thing to do, and you just think, oh my God, but we need a hand. And it's one thing with 20, 30, 40 years ago when some of these unfunded mandates, when they were mandated on the federal side, it wasn't that much of a burden for the community because no one really thought how specialized we'd become in 20 or 30 years. And nowadays, just look at the healthcare budgets. It's amazing. Now, healthcare, like in the state and local level, are 1/3 to 1/4 to 1/3 of the budget, mainly just on providing healthcare benefits. And that never would happen in years past. Right. It was always de minimis. It was 6 to 8% of most budgets 20 years ago.
Right. So something like No Child Left Behind, are they using the threat of not providing highway funds as a way to force people to do that? Is that actually how that works?
Among other funds, Homeland Security funds, just saying that if you don't maintain certain requirements, if you don't do as we're told, I know that especially with special ed funding, that they were going to strip the state of any other type of federal funding if special ed requirements weren't enforced. Now, Massachusetts at the time actually went one step further than the feds. This goes back to the maximum feasibility.
Right.
And I don't really want to revisit that right now, but Massachusetts, to its credit, 20 years ago, just thought that, hey, yeah, these requirements are there, free and appropriate, but we think we can go a little bit further. And no one thought at the time the cost elements or how progressive the actual field of education would become.
Interesting. So the whole federal side of this, they can lay down the law and use entirely unrelated funds as a weapon of choice to force you to do it, even though this may create a budget crisis within the state itself.
Generally speaking, and I'm not trying to make it, and poor Ed Markey's not here, but it always tends to go, like the locals tend to transfer the credit to the states, and the state tends to transfer the credits to the federal side. I think that in general, if you were to look at the situation and look to what the requirements are, they're not that far off from what the community's own aspirations tend to be. Right. Generally speaking, I'd like to believe that Winchester wants to provide the best and certainly the maximum feasible opportunity. I know it's non-existent to every child. Does it have the capabilities? No. Realistically, it does not.
Right. So that would be a case for the federal government in order to, first of all, make it more uniformly possible to provide funds to all the communities, because Winchester is comparatively affluent and many communities are considerably less affluent. Surely that's a case, an argument for the feds actually putting some money where their mandates are, so to speak.
And this is what happens every day, at least in the conduct of state government, would say, wouldn't that money be better spent? Like, you look at all the money that's being spent for you can say a war abroad, or for like a Triton missile, or for a submarine, a nuclear submarine that basically has no practical function in today's society. Why would that money just be used for special education, or for No Child Left Behind, or for and people, you can't help transfer that and think wouldn't there be a practical use for that? The state always gets this too, that with a big dig, all the funding that's coming in there. Could that money have been spent more towards education, or more towards school building construction, or more practical? What about universal health care for every single citizen in Massachusetts?
Right. I mean, these are the choices that in the public debate have to be made, and sometimes one scratches one's head when you see what ones actually do make.
And that's a common frustration I think each of us, whether you're an administrator or not, just faces. You say, wow, is there a better way of getting there, or spending that money? Keep in mind, though, the big dig, which is always like to say, how can you be blowing all this money? Even that, though, was federally funded. I mean, the majority is 75% federally funded.
Yeah. Mel, what are your thoughts on the challenges that unfunded mandates have handed to you? You're new in the job here, and I've seen in the Winchester Star this week, to give them a plug, that at least your budget, your good efforts to control the budget and make the compromises is well underway. How much of a headache has the unfunded mandate aspect handed to you in your work?
Sure. Well, unfunded mandates I find is a relatively new term, but local government has always been a highly regulated industry, if you will. Virtually every aspect of government, from personnel to contracting and procurement of supplies, highly regulated, municipal finance. And so it's something that people in my business are sort of accustomed to find the ways how to cut through these patchwork of regulations. But the unfunded mandates have become an issue as new mandates. I think Paul is very correct in saying when many of these mandates were created, our society was different. The way technology has advanced a great deal, and there's many different ways of doing things, and the mandates that were enacted way back when are really not appropriate today. And so I think the focus, though, going forward is letting the legislature and Congress know that when they are going to do new mandates, that they need to fund them. And that's really, I think, the issue that we're trying to impress. But regulation has always been a big part of local government. And I find myself, and I know Jim does the same, when we have an initiative, we think it's a good idea. Unfortunately, our first response is, well, what state law or federal regulation is going to prohibit us from doing that? And that's kind of sad.
Do you have a sort of a dollar sum that if you had to classify all these mandates and put a dollar figure on it, that you've had to, one way or the other, find local money for? Is there a sort of a good number for that?
No, I don't think so. And that has actually been an effort of the Massachusetts Municipal Association as it works with the legislature and the governor to try to develop reform to these mandates. We're always trying to get a price tag, and it's hard, frankly. Many of these things are difficult to quantify. I do agree with Paul's statement that in many cases, we want to do the right thing anyway. So in many cases, they're not issues. But in other cases, it's hard to put a dollar figure on. I think one of the areas that's probably, that I deal with a lot, that you probably can put a dollar figure on is some of the procurement and construction reform issues. Low bidding, filed sub-bidding, prevailing wages and so on. My guess is that our public construction projects are inflated by at least 25% because of some of these regulations.
But keep in mind, and this isn't necessarily point counterpoint, Winchester in the past has gained favor through the state by actually being able to skip some of the public procurement stuff, particularly in building the schools, because there are state mandates out there for prevailing wage that you have to pay a Boston rate as opposed to a suburban rate for school construction. But Winchester's been fortunate through the town's request, of course, to be able to leapfrog those with special home rule petitions to allow certain schools to not necessarily be built under prevailing wage or sub-bid laws. So there is a way to avoid a lot of those mandates. Certainly not the pension requirements stating that a person has to have 10 years minimum pension, but there are certain things that we've been able to shield the town and protect the town in years past.
Okay, so there is some
there's a little
opportunity to get
flexibility,
exception.
Mel. I mean, we've had a couple buildings just been able to.
I think through the efforts of a lot of folks, including everybody on this panel, there is a great awareness of the unfunded mandates and regulations, and there is really a new willingness, I find, to deal with them. And as I said, we find why we can't do it. Well, now we're identifying them, bringing to, we're just not resigned that that's the case. We are bringing them to the attention and trying to deal with them. So I think that's a good thing.
Well, I'll come back to another question later. I
This
really
opens the door. Yeah, we can talk.
My thoughts go back to the '60s when we protested more vigorously, and I just wonder with some of these whether, apart from I think subtle levels of negotiation, whether there isn't room at some stage to make a bolder statement back to the federal government for a start by saying, look, unless you do fund this, we're not going to do it, that sort of thing. But let me come back to that.
Sure.
Jim. What are your feelings on unfunded mandates and the budget squeeze?
Thank you. I would begin really by saying that Paul is right, that many of the programs we have in the schools, we would fight to have in the schools because it's the right thing to do, particularly especially in the area of special education, that those students aren't separate from the Winchester Public Schools. They're part of the community. They're part of the school system, and they are every bit deserving of an excellent education as any other student. So we would do everything, we would knock down walls to provide those kids with the programs that they need. However, when it comes down to when the resources get so thin that you really are dividing between your real core beliefs and which one has priority, and they're both sitting at the table as equals, becomes very painful. The underfunded mandates may be a better way of stating it.
Right.
In 1975, when the special education IDEA laws were passed, the promise was for special education there'd be a 40% reimbursement of all special education costs. So just to give you a thumbnail on that, we spend about $7 million on special education. A 40% reimbursement would be $2,800,000. We get about $2 million. We get about $700,000. We get about a 10% reimbursement. We don't get the 40%. We get about 10%. So we get about $700,000. So from my perspective, we are being underfunded by over $2 million that the federal government promised in 1975, but is not delivering on. So that would eliminate all of the issues that we have financially right now, and not just on the school side, but on the town side as well, if the federal government fulfilled its promise back in 1975.
I'm curious, I wasn't aware that it goes back that far.
Does
I'm trying to think who was president in 1975.
Probably Nixon. No,
No,
he was out then.
I think we were Jimmy Carter at that point.
Yeah.
Really?
Ford could have been alive.
Well, Jerry Ford, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe Jerry Ford.
Yeah.
But that's what people don't realize. They hear special ed, and suddenly it's something new. No, it's 30 years old.
Yeah, no, I really
But
wasn't aware.
special education is a much bigger program now, and we have a lot more awareness of it now.
Much
There's
more
so many
developed.
more children enrolled in it, and we know so much more about how to run a
Yeah.
quality special education program.
And I think one of the things that's worth saying, we talked about technology and how it has changed our society. It's also changed the society for human beings. More people are surviving birth, living, coming into our schools, coming into our society, and they are living, breathing, flesh and blood human beings. We owe them as much as for them as we gave to the previous generation. Their needs are extraordinary. There are students who are coming into our school system who have extraordinary physical needs, emotional needs, and cognitive needs that need to be met through the school system, not because it's a goody two-shoes thing, but because it's a community thing. And our society depends on every member being brought into that society as full members of that society and fully accepted. That costs money no matter what anyone says. So the underfunded mandate really puts the schools in a situation where we are not going to turn our backs on those students, because those students are us, and so we are going to deliver on that. But the underfunded mandate does, when the resources get really reduced, it does it creates what Carolyn and I talk about frequently, the most insidious kind of reaction in terms of, if it weren't for the special education, it's not about the special education, it's about the underfunded mandate for the federal government had actually promised that. And also, if it takes a lot of resources and money to educate a population of students, then I believe we have an obligation to those students, and we need to get the resources in order to educate those students from the community. But aside from just the special education now, the No Child Left Behind is an underfunded mandate as well. And I'll give you an example or two, just to give you a sense of what that's about for us. The No Child Left Behind took all these entitlement grants, Title I, Title II, Title III, and have now made them into goals. There are 5 goals. One goal is that every student in the country, but for Massachusetts it's going to relate to the MCAS test, that every student will be at proficient on the MCAS. They have to pass at the second from the top level by 2013. Now that requires additional tutoring, that requires additional teaching, it requires reading teachers in the school. And for the Winchester Public Schools, the No Child Left Behind is not fully funded. So we have to pick up, we had $165,000 in the Title I. Title I is measured by poverty level, and we measure that by free and reduced lunch. And we have 2 schools in our district that are Title I qualified schools. And we, 3 years ago, had like $165,000, and now we're going to be at like $110,000. While all other expenses go up, this funding is going down, and we hear from the Department of Education, you build your budget on 85% of last year's allocation. So that was last year. This year we hear, build your budget on 85% of last year's education. Well, last year's education is already reduced by that 15%. And so now we have to build it on
So it
the
ratchets
other
you down.
So,
Yeah, it's compounded, is
yeah.
what it would.
And if I could just give you one more example, then I'll stop talking. And that is, there's another goal for No Child Left Behind, that English language learners, those students who are new to our country, who are learning English for the first time and trying to interact with the educational system, by No Child Left Behind goals, they must also be proficient in mathematics and in English language arts in a certain amount of time. And No Child Left Behind is a critical mass. If you have 5% of your population that fall into that category, No Child Left Behind provides you with some funds. In Winchester, 3% of our population falls into that category. So Winchester doesn't receive any funds, but we would anyway, but by No Child Left Behind, it's a goal. They still require that we provide those services to those students. So as an example, out of the operating budget, we spend about $75,000 out of the operating budget to support those students, reading teachers, tutorial help, all of what goes along with that, where if we had a few more of those kids, No Child Left Behind, federal money would help to underwrite that.
Yes.
So it shows how the balance goes back and forth and draws off the operating budget pretty significantly.
It would seem that you end up having to trade off something like special ed with I guess, the No Child Left Behind, my impression is that it's kind of a mass attempt to goal everybody to certain levels of reading, writing, and I don't know about arithmetic, but and that may be in the end, for budget reasons, at odds with looking after the special education needs of a broader of the people outside of the absolute mainstream.
Yeah.
Is that sort of trade-off you get forced into having to make?
This year in particular, that the reductions are so severe. Remember now, 2 years ago we lost $300,000 out of the existing budget program. We had to cut $300,000. Last year we had to cut $800,000 from the then existing, not the wish list, but from the then existing program. And this year over $1 million out of the existing program. So when we talk about, and Carol and I have many discussions about this, and we're talking about having to reduce from those areas that we believe deeply in, then special education this year is in fact receiving or being hit with a rather significant reduction.
$200,000.
$200,000, which we're hoping is sustainable because we have those unfunded mandates. We must provide those students with the services they need. But we are trying to do some reorganization. We're going to be stretching our administrative staff to the nines, and they're already stretched. And we've been working very hard to see if we can make this work, but behind it is sort of an unraveling of just a wonderful system that has served students because we're competing, we're fighting over the pieces that are left, and all of those pieces are important. So we've made the cuts, we're working at implementation, and we're going to see, as we'll be monitoring it, because Carolyn and I and the group meet periodically to review the status of how things are going. And quite frankly, special education is taking a significant reduction this year. You're absolutely right.
Carolyn, can you help us all understand better what that's like and what the real human impact of this is? It would really, I think, help everybody to understand the realities that you're having to grapple
Absolutely. First, let me expand just a little bit on what Jim said in drawing a picture of the students who receive special education. And he talked about many of our students present with some very significant disabilities, and in fact they are very costly for the school system to educate. But Winchester provides special education services to more than 550 students right now. Now, you're not seeing most of those students, and in fact those students are our neighbors, they're our friends' children. We don't necessarily know who they are because their disabilities aren't obvious. But most of the people who receive services receive a few hours of a service a week.
Could you give some examples of these sort of disabilities? I'm not sure everybody really fully understands what
a language
what the range
delay is a classic example of a disability that requires intervention at a young age. And usually a child can be treated for a half an hour or an hour a week for a few years, and they're no longer classified as having a disability. That's how early intervention works. But on the continuum of special needs, that moves on into children who have other physical disabilities, children who have cognitive disabilities.
Just like dyslexia or that sort of
Yes,
thing?
things like dyslexia, children who may be blind or deaf, moves into children who have developmental delays like Down syndrome, and one of the disabilities that we see an ever-increasing number of today is autism. We don't know why that's increasing, but we have many students with autism, and to properly intervene at a young age is an expensive process. But it's a successful process when we follow quality standards to educate those children.
Well, what happens with these budget cuts? 200,000 this year. I had several hundred thousand already last year. How many staff members have you actually had to reduce staff
Specifically,
members?
special education will go from 3 student service coordinators down to 2. And the role of those student services coordinators is to facilitate every aspect of a child's experience in special education, beginning with when that child is referred for an evaluation and ending when that child transitions out of special education because they are no longer classified as having a disability, or ending when that child is of age to leave the school system. But they facilitate the evaluations, the writing of an individual education program, which is the document defining the education that that child will receive, and they facilitate coordination and communication amongst the team members who work with a particular child. And for us to go from 3 very, very stretched individuals down to 2 is risky, and some of the functions of those people will need to be spread to other staff in the school system, such as guidance counselors and principals. And that is a concern because those people are not necessarily qualified or trained to be making special education decisions. But last time I checked, no principals or guidance counselors in our school system had an ounce of spare time. Furthermore, they're going to be doing classroom duty in the absence of aides in the next school year.
So how will this play out then with the children? How will this? What do you see as the actual impact of that?
Well, there are actually 2 sides to the answer to that question. The first is that there are also instructors and a psychologist being cut from programs, and so students will have less time with the people who deliver their services. The second piece is that any cut in regular education hurts children in special education even more, I would like to put forth, because children in special education can often do very well in a regular education classroom, especially when the teacher has 20 students. When you start increasing the class size, the teacher has much less to offer each child, and all children suffer. But the children with special needs may find themselves in a position where they cannot function anymore in the room where they should be unless there are additional added supports, which is tough to make happen in this environment. Also, we're seeing cuts in electives and in specials like art, music, and gym, and those are the areas where many typical students who aren't fabulous students can enjoy feeling good about themselves, because they may not be a good student, but they may be a fabulous soccer player, or they may be a great singer. And that happens even more often with our students who have special needs, where every bit of academics is a struggle for them, but they can excel and feel good about themselves in those specials or in electives, and they're going to be losing that opportunity as the hours of those specials are diminished with the reductions in staff. So we are very concerned that these children are going to feel it from both ends. Furthermore, a child can be kind of walking on the line where teachers are asking, does this child have a disability and need services, or doesn't he or she? But that teacher can put forth some extra attention over the course of a year and get a child over a developmental hump, and they won't need special services. But if a teacher suddenly has too many children in her classroom, what she's going to do is write a referral for a special education evaluation right away, because she or he knows that they can't give that student what they need to stick it out for the next year that might otherwise have gotten them through a difficult time.
So there's a danger of these children falling in the cracks because of too big a class or a person not actually being available once they are
Absolutely, absolutely.
When you consider, as a result of the program reductions and the limited budget, the $1 million we had to take out this year, that we will be eliminating nearly 22 positions out of the system.
It's 22.
22 positions, and 11 and a half of those will be teaching positions. Some are aides, and some are program directors, coordinators that Carolyn was referring to. And imagine that right now our 5th grade classes across the district will be averaging from 29 to 34 students per class with no aide in there for assistance. At the high school level, we're anticipating over 100 sections just in the 5 or the 4 large academic areas, English, math, science, history, to have more than 27 students, which means it'll run into the mid-30s in some places. So, you know, we really are feeling very much that we are tearing at the fabric of the school system at its very core. At the middle school, at the 6th grade in the middle school, they had cut 2 teachers out of the 6th grade teams at the middle school. That means that students leaving the single classroom, one classroom, one teacher, elementary environment, going into the middle school where there are multi-disciplines and kids are changing classes all the time and they're in the middle of transition and developmental issues, and they're going to be going into classes 26, 28, 29 students in each class in 6th grade, where the teacher's ability to provide the kind of support that Carolyn is talking about is pretty significantly compromised. So we're feeling stress points in a number of different areas in the system.
What is the total headcount in the school?
The students?
Teachers. If you're reducing
I should know
22,
that.
is there a...
I don't have the exact number for you. I should know that. We'll cut that and I'll put it in.
Okay, in the meantime, Carolyn, you had
Can
a
I
point
share
to
with
make.
you my thoughts about unfunded mandates?
Please do.
I like to draw the analogy that the government, the big G government, which can be state and federal government, is acting like an insurance program, and they buy into a set of standards for the quality of care. They collect the funds and they distribute the funds as they're needed. And when we don't fund mandates, they are failing in one aspect of what they're supposed to do. But if you think about insurance a little bit more, we all pay health insurance, and sometimes we use more services, other times we use less services, and some people use more and some people use less. Now, I pay my insurance premiums, and when I see somebody who has a dreadful disease that's very costly to treat, I don't say, darn it, that person is making my premiums go up, because they become, the costs are very distant from the premiums that I pay. But when the mandates aren't funded and it comes down to a town level where we have to make decisions, should we fund this program or should we put more into special education, that is creating a divide between regular education and special education, and I think that that's a very wrong thing to do. And as Jim says, that's not the way we should be looking at it. But it's difficult for many people not to see it that way when the money going out of their pocket and going back into fund the services that they need remains very, very local. And I think the government isn't doing its job when they buy into the set of standards. And I'm not arguing with the special education standards. They're what they should be, but they need to be funded.
But look at the alternative, Carol. Let's just say, okay, the government, because a lot of this is goal-oriented. In government, you'd like to think that they can micromanage. They're horrible micromanagers, terrible. So when you try to legislate something across the board, and again, this was federal legislation, but let's just say from the state perspective, you try to legislate it across the board, you can't get into the minutia of what will expire from that edict, sort of speaking. Typically, a lot of reps will just say, okay, let's not do it at all. Imagine if there was no legislation on special education. Imagine it.
I think Carolyn's point, though, I think was that it is like an insurance pool, and having an insurance pool as small as a small township, it skews things. I think that's a problem with a lot of the funding things I see in this sort of micro zone, tiny township taxation system. There's a group risk across the whole country, and it's probably other than pollution hotspots, no particular higher risk or lower risk, and therefore it would be fair to have essentially a
ultimately born on a national scale. I'm not denying that. The worst thing about the last election, and I don't mean to segue into that, it was so divisive because there was a lot of agitprop. There's a lot of falsehoods being stated. Well, the state should be able to provide $7 million to the town. That was the number that was being used on the price list. That's bogus. It's not. Special education at that time, the town wasn't missing out on getting state reappropriations. I mean, it was
the
ludicrous.
town got what it was entitled to.
People were dying to have that. $7 million, wouldn't that have just got us out of the problem? Yes, should the state and federal government been able to provide that? Yes, but when you have a downturn in the economy, when you're $2 billion in a hole, it's not going to happen. And I think that the worst thing you can do on a local level is when you pit one group against another. It was divisive. It was wrong. It was just pure fabrication. But the response of the community should have been saying, "Oh, I'm appalled by that." Some people took it in and they loved the dribble and they used it as a reason pro or against the override. And all I'm saying as a community, if there is an awareness, if there's anything, it's that both sides lose. Your point was right on the mark. That even if the regular kids, streamlined kids, just get cut, any education gets cut, everybody suffers because of the class size. Ultimately, that's what you're trying to do is try to have more teachers for fewer kids. Ultimately,
I was going to throw the next question to you actually, as the representative of G, the big G for government, and having been involved in great depth in state taxation policy and so forth. What you had mentioned around about the time of the override, or one of your aides had, that there was a change in the town funding formula coming along. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think at the time we're talking about special ed circuit breaker, Jim, which was never existent up to 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And granted, it's a weak hook to lay a hat. But again, it's the state's effort to realize that some communities are up against it. They can't expend money for extraordinary costs or extraordinary challenges, and they kick in. And so when you see a $700,000 paid for by the state, which they should be paying, I mean, I'll grant you the $7 million or somewhere between. It's an effort on the state's part to say, listen, there are extraordinary challenges out there for communities, big and small, and the state should be paying.
Is there a town formula change? That was what I understand. I forgot what the name of the
well,
grant was.
we're trying to do, this is Ed Reform 2, where the fear was after the Hancock case. And to all those viewers, so there is some good news on the horizon, and some of the real left advocates would say, no, this was terrible. But the Hancock case came out and said that the state is trying to put its best foot forward. Because in literally 10 years, we've put $30 billion into education. Who would have thought that back in 92, 93? I mean, Winchester itself, back in 93, Jim, and correct me if I'm wrong, only received about $800,000 or $900,000 in education. Now, up to about 2 years ago, it was close to $4 million. Yes, 2004 was a tough year. We actually cut the $4 million or the $3.8 million down to about 3.2, 3.3, and that's terrible. You should hold every community harmless. But again, there was a $2 billion budget shortfall, so they did cut into it.
2.9.
2.9. So we did, and that was wrong, Jim. I'm not proud of that. But at the same time, my statement is that without that state interference, without that state assistance, since '93 on, we staved off at least 8 or 9 overrides. If we did not have that bump up, and it's a theory, and people say, oh yeah, you're self-aggrandizing yourself. But no, it's the truth of the matter is, from 900,000 to close to 4 million, up to 2 years ago. And that was an infusion of state funds that protected Winchester to some degree. Education 2 is coming out, and everybody knows the Education 1. At the time when Education 1 first was coming out, the Ed Reform 1, everyone said, the state's not going to be able to fund it. They're not going to be able to fund it. It's impossible. The state did fund it up until about 2 years ago, appropriately. Now what's happening on Ed Reform 2, much more dynamic input than it was 10 years ago, because at that time, my superintendent would tell me, I think it was Fitz at the time, Bob Fitzgerald, it just said, hey, any increase is a good increase. Just sign away. Let's get some bumped up in education, because it hadn't been happening in the 80s and early 90s. Nowadays, guys like Jim Marini are coming to the state reps and say, let's recalculate and reconfigure the formula. And we are weighing those variables. And so if there is an Ed Reform 2, I think we're going to be in a much better position. A per student formula is the Ed Reform 2, which I've endorsed, because why? It benefits Winchester much better than a city-weighted type of formula.
Well, it seems more fair too, I mean, ultimately.
Well, if you were from the city, you might disagree. You might say that we have much more infrastructure costs. Our problems are much more severe. The homogeneity of the suburbs lessens the impact of the challenges as opposed to those in the cities. I'm just giving the counterpoint. Right. So there's going to be a fight. And you will have a suburb versus a city mentality on Ed Reform 2. I can't tell you for sure when that's going to be happening. The debate's going to be happening this spring.
David,
go ahead, please.
May I ask Paul to follow up on?
Yeah,
Paul
please.
said a whole bunch of things that I really think one or two things really need clarity for the viewing audience as well.
Please.
He referred to a flyer that was distributed before the vote that in the flyer indicated that close to $7 million was 100% reimbursable if the school department had filled out the appropriate paperwork. So I want to be definitive, as clear as I can on this, that there is no reimbursement from the state for special education costs in general. There is no reimbursement at all.
So that
So
piece of
that's
paper was false.
100% false.
Fabrication, and that was disgusting
I wanna
how
be clear on that,
perverted
yeah.
that was.
What the state does have is what's referred to as the circuit breaker. For those few students, this is what Carolyn talked about, $360,000, which is what Winchester receives because it does indeed all the paperwork required. For those students whose special education, whose education costs surpass $30,000, the local district pays the first $30,000. For that portion above $30,000, the state is trying to reimburse the towns at 72% of that increase, of that increment that's above the $30,000. Now, 2 years ago, they were not able to deliver on that when it was under a different formula. They were not able to deliver. Last year, they delivered a little more, and this year, it's somewhat volatile, but we're hopeful that it will be returned, but we don't know whether we'll get it all. But the point is, all the paperwork that needs to be done to receive that reimbursement is always filed, and it's filed on time. The claim that we can be reimbursed for the $7 million for special education is just plain false.
So when we
I just
describe
wanna
that not as
clarify.
false,
Is that right, Paul?
Positively.
but a smear at the same time.
A smear, oh yeah, definitely.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to get my eraser.
Yeah,
get a
and
smear
here
out of
I'm
it.
using words like agitprop, but it was beyond propaganda. It was disgusting prevarication. I mean, it was just a lie. Now, should the state be on the hook for $7 million? Yeah, I'm not denying that. In a perfect world, yeah, we should be, but that's not reimbursable, and that was a fabrication and complete. But it was done obviously to
affect the outcome
rally
of
the
the-
forces against an override.
yes.
But with the effect of that is what's really
That's right.
poignant and disgusting. It put one group of kids against another group.
Yes, and
One
that-
group of parents
and that
against
is
another
pretty
group
low.
of parents.
Really low. Mel.
And was that your fault, Mel? No, I'm sorry.
Remember, I'm the new town manager.
Sorry.
You're representative of a small G government, but you're trying to manage this horrible set of trade-offs that you've been handed. How have you felt about that, and what do you see if you were emperor for a day and could push back on the state and federal government? What would you ask of them to help you do your job more effectively?
Sure. Well, I think Paul touched on it and said that government, certainly the federal government, state government, they can't micromanage well, and of course they can't. That's not the function of the legislative branches of government. And so what I have always espoused, and certainly the organizations that represent city and town government, is that the goals are prudent and appropriate for government to establish, but the means and the methods of achieving those should be left to the people who are at the local level. And so that's really the message that I'd like to. And I don't believe the federal government is trying to mess things up when they micromanage, but in fact, over a long period of time, that is in fact the outcome or the impact of what all of these various independent laws and regulations have done. They've really created a hamstring on the ability of local government officials to meet those goals in an efficient manner. Let me give you a couple of examples. In health insurance, which as you've heard is a major expense of any employer who provides it. In Massachusetts, there was a law. It's called Chapter 32B. It covers health insurance, regulates health insurance for local government employers, and that law was enacted and in place long before we ever heard of the HMOs or any other managed care products. And so what happened is when those products were introduced and have been successful in reducing the cost of health care, the state, through either legislation or perhaps even through the court system, determined that, well, a town like Winchester that paid 50% of health insurance now had to pay not 50% of the HMO cost, but the same dollar amount that it was otherwise paying for the older product. And that's just an example of something that's just not logical. The other point is the state mandates that we must provide health insurance to any employee who works 20 or more hours. So when we're in a mode of trying to reduce our workforce, we're constantly trying to play games to avoid that threshold, when in fact it might be easier to do it a different way. But we're always trying to figure out the right way to stay out of trouble, to save money. And so my goal would be to encourage government, when it passes new laws, to look at the existing laws on the books and make sure that we're not hamstrung by those.
I must say it's a tragedy that you see this in business as well as in government, that people are navigating around the healthcare insurance issue. And in the country I come from, everybody has healthcare, and it's never an issue in employment or deciding headcount or who goes or who stays. I think it's a very sad thing that the United States has to deal with this. It's about the only Western country that does. But that's just an aside editorial comment. I do understand, Paul, from various articles I've read, that in terms of federal funds, when they're analysing how much goes to the red states versus the blue states, that we seem to be getting in the 85 cents on the dollar, while the red states get $1.20. Is that real? Are we getting shortchanged by the federal government because they don't like our politics?
With that particular article came out, it was at the time of Newsweek, and they were just mentioning that. Is there a line or an attribution to the being a democratic state? Massachusetts has in the past, though, done very well in terms of federal reimbursements, whether we mention the Big Dig, whether we mention the military buildup, which is, we have many people in Winchester working at Raytheon, MITRE, and many other military-like organizations or companies that utilize and interface with the military. The number that is used, David, I'm not denying, but I think we're pretty well covered down in Washington. I think where that number gets where it gets traded off in Massachusetts, particularly, is because now the big data funds are over, they're completed. So there's going to be I won't say a layoff, but certainly a ratcheting down of federal funds coming to the state alone on that topic. There is accusations that to the victor go the spoils. I mean, that's why I was always, my view, like him or not, I was with Kerry only because I thought the money that would be coming back to the state would be enormous as opposed to the alternative. But there is obviously a favoritism involved in down DC. There is a favoritism involved at the State House also. It tends to be a city type of oriented legislature. This time around particularly, you see a lot of city reps being appointed to the key committees. Will that show off in terms of monies and appropriation? Probably not local aid stuff, but maybe in other types of projects that get approved. But I think that's one of the appeals of why people voted for Romney in the first place, was kind of a suburban view saying, let's bring a suburban person in, party aside, somebody who can actually do the job across the board without providing favoritism. But there's a cost to that. By doing that and by supporting the governor as it currently is, I think there's a detachment because he doesn't work with the legislature. I remember the Herald the other day, and I'm doing it. They're accusing the governor of not being human, and here he is. So, yeah, but ironically enough, Jim, he cuts a work bank for a dad who's trying to take care of his kid who has leukemia. I mean, and that's the human contact that's non-existent up there. And the Herald goes later on to describe how can you cut out a sick leave bank. Sick leave bank for all those viewers. It's just that Mel wants to give me 2 days of his 2-week sick bank. Jim decides to give me 3. It's an accumulation of his workers, his co-workers saying, we want to try to help you out during these difficult times, and you need legislative approval. This is part of the micromanaging. And here's the governor vetoing that. So do I see good things happening on the human level coming up with the administration? No, I don't. But what I do see is just that there will be a group effort on the part of legislators to say, hey, listen, we've got to provide a human touch, and we have to provide the important things like funding special education circuit breaker. Will that be bumped up? No, but it's going to be funded to what we said last year. Should we be making inroads into providing more for special education? Yeah, but I think overall, Jim, because it's one of those issues, I think overall most communities are going to jump together and say, we got to just provide more money for education, period.
Yeah,
But that's the whitewashing. It gets painted by the same brush, and unfortunately, the minority, and it's not a minority view, but almost the minority representation, those who favor special education or tout special education as the #1 issue, they get sidelined a little bit.
One of the things to remember about special education and why sometimes there should be a per pupil reimbursement is that it's almost a luck of the draw sometimes, that it can take 1 or 2 students arriving in a town to suddenly increase that town's special education requirements for spending $200,000. Now that would be 2 very unusual students, but that can happen if Winchester were to suddenly have $200,000 worth of needs show up in our town. That would put many of our programs at risk, and it's because Winchester has a good school system, people like to come, but it's not necessarily very fair.
In your case in point, occurred in Orange, Mass. I think it was Orange, Mass, where their whole education budget was $500,000. They had 1 student who needed $150,000 for that student's challenges. What do you do as a community? 1/3 your budget? And how do you address that? And so I think that's a case that we're very sensitive to. But I think overall there's a suburban effort, and through the help of MMA. I mean, the town managers know kind of what's going on throughout the state, but you really see the suburban reps and the town managers getting together and saying, hey, all right, we did the right thing. We've funded it, and we're up to the $30 billion mark. But now in the future, let's do a per student or per pupil type of formula. That's what's been popular up there right now. There's a growing feel and popularity for this ed reform too, with this new formulaic change.
I like Carolyn's use of the term insurance, because it would seem, and your example is very good, the $150,000 child. If you don't have an insurance pool that is national in scope, that kind of situation is going to clearly create unfair impact at random around the place.
Random is a good word.
And it really needs to be a shared risk that the whole community signs up for. And therefore, I would feel needs to be at a federal level for that reason.
And people with disabilities leave the school system someday. Most of them go on to college, and most of them lead very successful lives. Some of them will require support for the rest of their lives. Now that, I believe, goes right onto state expenditures. But these people will require much less support later if they get quality intervention early on. And there are facts and studies to support that statement, that people with disabilities who receive a quality education are much more independent, require less services, and contribute more to society when they get the education that they need. So it shouldn't be a random thing as a result of where you live that defines the quality of special education.
That's very interesting. So that really provides a good business budgeting rationale for why it would be good policy
it's good business
to
sense.
fund this now, because it's pay me now $1 instead of $10
Exactly.
later.
But that's where special education circuit breaker, and again, I'm not touting its vast success, but it's a step in the right direction, does address that case, where it's anything over 30,000. The reason why they only reimburse the community over 72%, they still want to give incentives to the community to try to spend less. So, I mean, if you did 100% reimbursement, well, then Cadillac. Then anything over 30,000, yeah, let's spend it all. So
although I'd like to think that Jim Marini would want to keep that student right there in the school district in the first place. But I'll let you go on with your example.
And that's unfair for me to say otherwise. But less scrupulous superintendents might not.
Okay.
Who minds? But
I'd like to, may I?
Yes, please.
Pick up on the ed reform too, and to just say that when ed reform was passed in '93, and then you're right, Paul, as we went into the first half of the 90s, the state was delivering on its promise for special education and was providing cities and towns with significant amounts of money to meet the needs of ed reform. Time and learning, lengthening the school day, teacher training, curriculum development, all of that money that was necessary because they were asking schools to do more. Now we're up at doing more. And then in 2003, the state aid dropped by 20%. We still have the obligation, but the state aid dropped by 20%, and since then it's been flat. While everything else continues to grow, the state aid has remained at that lower level. So the issue for the school department is that and for the town, I think, Mel, is that those costs are shifted over to the local community. There's no other source of revenue except for the local community, and we are at the place where the system is ready to break. And so all that can happen in terms of, I know you're trying like crazy, but to get state aid, Chapter 70 funds back into the town so that we can address the issues that we have, legitimate. This is not the Cadillac system we're talking about here. We're talking about basic education. Instead of 33 kids in the class, let's get that down to the mid-20s. Let's bring those classes down so that those students have a chance. The state aid is really a pivotal point here to bring some of that back.
And while the state aid is decreasing, I, as the citizen against the state government, would say it's also the state government or state regulations which give us Prop 2.5, which makes increases the level of difficulty of raising local funds. So the expenses are pushed to us, and it's difficult to find the funding to pick them up.
I am going to unfortunately have to draw this to a close. This hour has gone like faster than I could
David,
possibly.
we really want to start talking about 2.5.
I know.
Kleckner was going to jump right in there.
Well, he's going to have a second shot
is
in our
it.
next show, as a matter of fact.
Do you want me to copy?
Bring it
do you
right
want me
up.
to copy your notes for
So
you?
let
Bring it
me
right on.
let me take the opportunity to thank you, Paul, and Mel, and Jim, and Carolyn for being here today to cover a topic that I think is very, very sensitive and near and dear to a lot of members of the community. And thank you very much for contributing.
And David, thanks for providing this insight.
Thank
It's
you.
important to be able to sit down and talk rationally
Yeah.
instead of at the end of a tomato.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
So-
you very much, David.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us at Winchester's very own Talk of the Town.